You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
Hi, everybody. My name is Andreas Petrosians. I'm the associate editor of e-flux Journal, and I'm really happy to be here today with Andrew Ross. Hi.
Hello. Happy to be here, too.
Andrew Ross is a social activist and professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU. He's a frequent contributor to numerous publications and the author or editor of almost 30 books and hundreds of articles on a wide variety of topics. He is the co-founder of several groups, among them Gulf Labor Artist Coalition, Global Ultra Luxury Faction, Coalition for Fair Labor, Occupy Student Debt, Strike Debt, The Debt Collective, and Decolonize This Place, and is an organizer with others, including the American Association of University Professors and the U.S. Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. He also serves on the steering committee of the National Network of Faculty and Staff for Justice in Palestine. His most recent book is The Weather Report, A Journey Through Unsettled Climates, out from Common Oceans, which we'll be speaking about today. So, hi again. I thought to start, before we get into the meat and potatoes of the book itself, I wanted to talk a little bit about your approach to reporting, and specifically how you approach a topic like the one in this book. So often, studies about climate catastrophe, in my opinion, kind of struggle to make visible the inextricable connections between forms of exploitation, say, dispossession, occupation, on the one hand, and climate collapse on the other. And I would say that it's not necessarily that they ignore those connections, but rather that they are seen as complementary crises, rather than part of the same extractive terms of order, as Cedric Robinson might say. Financialized, fossil, capitalist totality, in a manner of speaking. So one remedy that you use in this book and your other work is to look at these various crises from the perspective of people in active struggle. As you write in the introduction, the spirit of the fierce alliance between anti-capitalist movements and popular ecological resistance animates the book. So to start, could you talk about your approach to having conversations and relationships with people on the front lines and how this allows you to take a particular approach in your reporting?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I think you're right that the book is informed or framed by the spirit of certain movements. What's often called environmentalism of the poor and more radical regions of the climate justice movement. But it's not a book about movements per se, so it's not really a movement book in that regard. It is a book of reportage, and my methodology, since you asked, is something I call scholarly reporting. It's a blend of fairly rigorous research that academics would recognize. But at the same time, the narrative voice is the voice of a reporter, and I try and approach the topic in the spirit of an investigative reporter. So there's some story there that I'm trying to get and frame into the form of a useful narrative. It's also not a theoretical book, and so I take my cue from the people I interview along the way. Some of them are movement people, some of them are driven by other preoccupations, and some of them are chance encounters, depending on context and location. But I really do try to take my cue from them, and because the book is kind of located in 4 different places, I guess it's underpinned by the perception or the experience that climate justice takes different forms. For sure, you can have global propositions about climate justice, and they're 10 a penny. But concerns, for example, about overpopulation, which is one of the themes in the book, have a different meaning in a place like Arizona as opposed to, say, China, which are 2 of the locations, and then access to natural resources in Palestine has a different meaning than it would have in the UAE, which is the 4th location, even though they're both in the Middle East. Quite a different story to tell. So overall, I'm trying to be attentive to local detail, while not shrinking from, drawing lessons from the local that could be applied more internationally.
Yeah, so you've already done a better job introducing the book than I have, just mentioning that there's 4 different climates that the book tracks. And we can talk about this as kind of a longer process of your reporting and your engagement with these places, because these are all places you've been to before for different reasons, right? So Palestine, Dubai, Phoenix, Arizona, and China. I actually did want to ask you about this. You call it elsewhere as a left eclectic allergic to despair, which I think the first chapter on Palestine actually demonstrates that very clearly, because the chapter speaks about how Israel has used water as a weapon of occupation, as a weapon of dispossession and exclusion in the West Bank and in Gaza. And the chapter is really heavy, going back over 100 years to how basically the making Palestinians thirsty has been part and parcel of this occupation. But it ends in I wouldn't say an optimistic way, but by turning to active struggles, to resistance farmers. But yeah, before we talk about the left eclecticism and this allergy you have to despair, which I hope is contagious via this podcast, maybe can you tell us a little bit about your longstanding relationships in Palestine and how you use the history of this sort of what we might call water apartheid as a way to tell two stories, that of occupation and that of climate change?
Sure. Just to go back, the 4 locations are places I've previously written books, and I've been returning to some of them for some time, for others not so often. And I decided I would spend a sabbatical year revisiting each of these locations. I didn't actually intend to write a book, but writing books is one of the few things I know how to do in life. So that's how it ended up. And overall, it's a sort of book about how the colonial engineering of this balance between population growth and access to natural resources, shrinking natural resources, gives rise to climate justice crises. But as I said, it has a different inflection in each of these locations. Palestine, I've been traveling to the West Bank for more than a decade now, most summers, interviewing people on one topic or another. And the book kind of originated 6 weeks before October 7th, because I was interviewing villagers in central West Bank about the water shortage. And it's a chronic water shortage. It's not a natural water shortage. It's entirely created and manipulated by Israeli authorities, because people who live in the Central Highlands, the West Bank, they're basically living on top of a vast and abundant aquifer, but they're not allowed to dig wells and pump water from the aquifer. And most of the rainfall that falls in the highlands, it finds its way into Israel, one means or another. So the lesson here is one about how scarcity is manufactured, and Israel has its hands on the water tap and can turn it on and off at will, which it does, as a form of collective punishment or otherwise. And over time, because of what's been happening in Gaza and the starvation crisis right now, people are dying of dehydration faster than they die of malnutrition. And so the water is my story, basically, my point of entry, and the story that I tried to cover, as you point out, going back 100 years or so. And I end up, taking issue a little bit with the paradigm of water apartheid. I think a lot of human rights NGOs are long used to pointing out, and this is statistically supported, that Palestinians, especially those who aren't hooked up to the water network that Israel controls, have a daily access to much less water than the WHO recommends, and Israelis have access to abundant supplies of water. And they say, well, this is clearly a picture of water apartheid. And that's all very well, but I take issue with that phrase and that term generally, because it's not dynamic enough. It doesn't capture what happens on a daily basis, which is the use of that power to deprive people of water, to colonize and drive them off the land and seize the resources in the land, and so on and so forth. So I refer to it as colonization through dehydration, as opposed to water apartheid. And it's not a very elegant term, but it's not an elegant thing it's describing either. So again, it has a very specific context in Palestine, but there are lessons to be drawn from that I think can and should be applied elsewhere.
Yeah, I think going back to the kind of proposition I was kind of putting forward earlier in the conversation, this sort of difficulty of seeing two different sides of one larger extractive, exploitative terms of order, to use that term again. A word like water apartheid maybe contributes to that obfuscation, right? Like it's water can be a leverage point, it could be a tool, and the deprivation of it, as you say, is actually fundamental, not just understanding how these places adapt to a changing climate, but how they change through quote unquote man-made, right?
Yes, exactly. And apartheid doesn't, I mean, I don't mean to take issue with the application of apartheid to the Israeli state itself, because I think it holds up that the laws and rules and regulations of the state are segregationist in fundamentally so. But what happens in the occupied territories is a little different. And I don't think apartheid is so useful.
Right.
In that regard.
Yeah, as you say, different contexts have different specificities.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that this sort of, to go back to this optimism that I'm finding in your work, and as I was rereading some of your books in preparation for today's conversation, I realized that you do this a lot, which is really great. At the end of a really difficult chapter or a really difficult story, you will remind us that, people are doing stuff and we have to pay attention to it. It's not just that we have to pay attention to it, but it can teach us stuff, right? So I was kind of struck by your focusing at the end of that first chapter on resistance farming, because it made me think, actually here at e-flux, we published a collage of different autonomous farming collectives a couple of years ago across North America who were using food sovereignty as a way to sort of contest not just fossil capital, but policing, et cetera. And it was interesting to me that even though the contexts are vastly different, although, different maybe moments in the long arc of settler colonialism, let's say. But it was interesting that that similar tactics can be applied to confront them. Yeah, you say that these resistance farmers are kind of emblematic of the ability to persevere, but it can also be an unfair burden in a way. So you say that no matter the insurmountable obstacles and reasons for despair, these resistance farmers remain condemned to hope. So I wanted to ask you, somebody who's been reporting for decades on various front lines of struggle, how do we remain rooted in this possibility of revolutionary horizon? If that makes sense.
That's an easy question.
Yeah, you have 2 minutes.
Here's what I feel, Andreas. I feel it's part of the responsibility, political responsibility, not to reinforce left despair, which is, however grounded it is in the evidence and the facts, is very corrosive. And I feel it's the responsibility of commentators, intellectuals, organizers to really offer a reason to get out of bed in the morning. And a lot of the most critical critiques that are on the shelf don't necessarily do that. And I find my gauge is always, young people. I'm an academic, I teach, so I spend a lot of time with young people, and that's an important source of feedback. And I also organize with a lot of young people who are about a third my age. So I try to get a sense of what gets people out of bed in the morning and adjust accordingly. In addition, I would say that even looking for proactive initiatives, which I do in every chapter of this book, wherever I visit, I'm always looking for something to focus on. The resistance farming is the example from the Palestine chapter. It's you just don't know what shape or what influence or what future career these micro examples are going to have or yield. We can't tell in advance. If we could, we would be prophets, not revolutionaries. And I've learned over the years that I've been involved in some initiatives that were very marginal and completely left field and moved fairly rapidly into the mainstream over time. Debt abolition, being one example. I was one of the founders of the Occupy Student Debt campaign with our comrade George Kafensis, as it happens. And back in the day, that was such a marginal issue and moved quite rapidly over the course of 10 years into the mainstream. And onto the desk of the White House and so on and so forth. So now it's no longer a question of can we abolish that? It's a question of how much should we abolish? And that's one good lesson that I offer in organizing that speaks to that issue. With the example of the resistance farming in Palestine, it's a reference to the small agricultural cooperatives that have sprung up in the last 5 or 6 years or so, but especially after the Israelis cut off work permits for Palestinians to work in Israel after October 7th. And that's as many as 200,000 people, and a major source of income for Palestinians. So a lot of them started to work on their land, the family land again, which hadn't been profitable compared to working in Israel on a construction site, to put it bluntly. And so this return to the land took various forms, but one of them was the rise of these agricultural cooperatives, many of them run by college graduates, and the principles, sustainable principles of agroecology and food sovereignty and so on and so forth. And, sort of coalescing around the general principle that unless a people can feed themselves, then they cannot liberate themselves. I guess that would be the fundamental principle. So I didn't think I'd find a silver lining, quite frankly, in my reportage from Palestine, but this was one example I found. And I don't know what future it will have. We don't know. A lot of these farms are in Area C. They're very close to settlements. They're scrutinized very closely, and they're sabotaged also by the settlers. So good luck.
I think that kind of, I don't want to say optimism because that makes it sound like it's in opposition to some kind of pessimism. But, hope is not a necessary resource in these things. But I did want to talk about this relationship between your own personal political organizing and the reporting that you do, the writing that you do, as a way to talk about the chapter on Dubai, which, as always, you bring yourself in very interesting ways, and you begin the chapter talking about how you were barred from entering the country after your previous organizing work, which you should feel free to talk about. I also wonder if it was for writing sentences like this. Dubai's capitalist oasis may turn out to be a prototype for the eco-apartheid citadels of the future, where essential work is performed by rightless migrants who are allowed entry only to occupy informal jobs without any workplace or social protections. I will say it sounds less like a dystopian future and more like something you might read on the front page of a daily newspaper to describe a lot of places. But you were able to go in to go visit COP28. Can you tell us about what it was like to be there and to see this? What would you call it? Performative? I don't know.
That's what the youth call it, performative.
Yeah, but have you noticed that somehow that word meant not what it meant in sort of gender theory for many years, and now it's kind of flipped back somehow? Yeah. It's very interesting. Eventually it corrected itself through memes.
True, through memes.
But yeah, tell us about COP28.
Well, you mentioned I'd been barred from entering the UAE. That was back in 2015 as part of the work we were doing with the Gulf Labor Coalition, which was an international coalition of artists and curators and writers trying to raise labor standards for migrant workers in the Gulf generally, but in the UAE specifically. The government didn't like what we were doing there, Abu Dhabi in particular, where we were mostly taking testimony from workers in labor camps. So they banned myself and a couple of other comrades from entering the country. And when COP28 swung around, which is a climate summit that happens regularly, and it was this year in 2023, it was in Dubai. I thought, well, maybe there's a chance I could get back in. Usually when you're banned for life. There's a chance I could get back in because they wouldn't want too much bad publicity about keeping people out. But my visa application initially got denied, and then some journalist from the Financial Times was going to write a story about myself and a couple of other folks in the human rights field who had also having trouble getting in. He called up the Dubai visa office, and within an hour, my visa was approved. Showed
So strange.
Well, it shows who has the power.
Yeah.
The Financial
Times.
The capitalist press. So I did go, and I learned a lot from attending that event. I'd never been at a climate summit before. I learned a lot about the two-faced policy that the major fossil producers are pursuing with regard to their domestic policies are net zero and ultimately laudable in reducing carbon emissions, while their export policies are gangbusters in terms of stepping up hydrocarbon extraction and selling the products to poor countries in the world that don't have the resources to build clean technologies. So this is quite fascinating to watch how that climate diplomacy, that two-faced climate diplomacy, was being pursued at the summit. And so I learned a lot in that regard. Was it merely performative? There's a very theatrical aspect to climate diplomacy on that kind of world stage. And there is a sense in which anyone who's attending is part of an audience, is an audience member. But what I would say is that these gatherings are opportunities for climate activists to get together internationally, come together from four corners of the world, meet each other, conspire, plot, and build relationships and coalitions. And I think in that regard, it performs that kind of useful purpose, or up until now, say for the last 10 years, it has done. It may be that these climate summits are running out of steam and losing whatever purpose they once had. It's difficult to say.
They're running out of coal, but they're still using it. Sorry, I had to. Yeah, I mean, to that point, a few years ago, I was very lucky to meet some indigenous organizers from various South American countries. And they were in town for a UN summit, which they all told me was a huge waste of time, except for the fact that they all got to gather here.
Yeah.
And we had great assemblies in various places. So it is a great excuse to meet each other.
Yeah.
Sorry, one other thing I'll say before we move, just to give people some context, is this really basic fact that you keep returning to in this chapter, which is, in these big discussions about who gets to burn fossil fuels so that they're allowed to catch up with the rest of the quote-unquote developed world, one very important rubric is that you can still produce and drill and export a humongous amount of fossil fuels. As long as you don't burn them yourself, it doesn't count. So
exactly.
Places like Brazil, China, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And they all get plaudits for, Norway is probably the best example of a country that gets a lot of plaudits for its domestic policies. But Norway will sell oil to anyone.
Right.
And they're stepping up their production.
Right.
All of them are.
Can you talk about your time on a Scottish oil rig, which you go into in this chapter?
I do. Well, this is something I've written about that often when I'm researching topics and sometimes writing books about them, I discover fairly late on in the process that I have had some personal connection that has in some way unconsciously or otherwise driven me to the topic. And so sometimes it's only after I finish the book that I realize, oh, that's why I was writing this book. And in this case, it really wasn't until I'd been there for some time that I remembered relevantly that I had worked on an oil rig in the North Sea, and I did have an experience that was relevant here when I wrote my book about Palestinian stonemasons and construction workers, stone men. It was late on that I remember that I worked on a lot of construction sites when I was a student and in high school and so on and so forth. So I had that experience, and it is a very visceral and tangible experience of working with materials, cement and concrete and stone and so on and so forth. And I'd forgotten all about that, despite the fact that I was writing about workers who were involved in those industries. So that's how the the interlude in the chapter about Dubai involves my experiences on the oil rig. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the way you bring in your own stories, not just because they provide a certain kind of uh, maybe embodied experience, if you want to call it that, or something like that, but more also just for the, let's say, the periodization that your own experiences allow, right? So I was rereading your book from 2011, Bird on Fire, where you report on Phoenix, the city you call the least sustainable city in the world, right? Yes. And you wrote in 2011, the anti-immigrant mood that has sharpened during Arizona's recessionary years stands as a harbinger of the hoarding mentality that may well govern a desperate future. And, you know, it's not hard to see that desperate future around us today, whether in the ice raids or the fact that Joe Arpaio seems to have multiplied into a million different figures appearing everywhere, extrajudicial killings and executions of people in boats off the coast of Venezuela and Colombia. You know, and I'm bringing this up here to kind of tie it back to climate. As you wrote in the 2011 book, Bird on Fire, and in this book, where you dedicate a chapter to Phoenix, you say quite rightly that we can consider a lot of the people crossing borders from the global south into the global north as climate refugees. So yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I guess I'm curious on how you've seen this, how you've developed this perspective after having visited these places and reported on them for so many years, but also what we kind of gain from an organizational perspective, from an organizing perspective, and understanding migrants as climate refugees.
Well, it's a big question, and it's an issue that I raised in that book back in 2011, I think it was published, Bird on Fire. I did argue at the time that many of the border crossers coming into Arizona were climate refugees, and that they were coming as carbon creditors, if you like, because the lifestyles, northern lifestyles that are high carbon, were creating the conditions that had displaced them. You know, Arizona is in the bullseye of global warming, drying out much faster and heating up much more quickly than anywhere else in the hemisphere. And global warming doesn't stop at the border. It affects the whole of Central America and further south. And there's something called the dry corridor in Central America, which is particularly powerless in this context, and a lot of people being displaced from there because of climate change and elsewhere. So they're coming with debts owed to them by carbon debtors in the north. And I did a lot of media and appearances in Arizona at the time, and there wasn't much uptake on this argument, and there still isn't to some degree. But as you point out, the discourse has advanced since then, and has heightened the hysteria about border crossing, especially during an election year when I was writing that chapter, was through the roof. And to write that chapter, I visited the border 3 times, the Arizona-Mexico border fence. And the first time was before Biden sealed the border as part of his vainglorious re-election campaign. And then I visited again after the sealing of the border. And then the third time was in March of this year, after Trump had come to power and militarized the border, essentially. And over the course of time, obviously the visible traffic diminished to almost zero. The people who are crossing just go directly across the desert now. They don't hang around because there's no right to asylum, which was revoked essentially by Biden, not Trump. And but when we did meet the border crossers, and I was there with humanitarian groups like the Tucson Samaritans, out of all the people we talked to, none of them were going to stay in Arizona. They were all heading to, because we asked them, where are you going? They said, we're going to New York or Chicago or LA. They weren't going to hang around in Arizona. So the hysteria among, right-wing eco-fascist types in Arizona about these foreigners with their wasteful ways coming to live among us as an invasion force, as a threat to our resources, because the eco-fascist part of this is that we must seal our borders because these foreigners will put undue pressure on our natural resources. That's the way it is articulated in places like Arizona. This claim is completely evidence-free, completely devoid of the facts that the vast majority of the border crossers were heading elsewhere.
Yeah, one of the many right-wing hysterias and panics that are just emboldened by liberals when they are in power. Another one is population, fears of population growth, which is the focus of the 4th chapter on China. I went back to a great essay after reading this chapter by Jason Smith, published last year in the Brooklyn Rail, where he said kind of a really great pithy, well, it's actually pithy, maybe it's the wrong word because it's a very long essay, but it's very smart. And he says, unlike prior demographic revolutions, the current free fall in population growth seems less set in motion by a corresponding mutation in the mode of production than a manifestation of the current one's unraveling, which seems to do a good job at describing the case in China, where population growth is declining quite rapidly, and the government is very afraid of this. But as a lot of the young women you talk to in China, who you spoke with to write the chapter, said, yeah, maybe they want to encourage us to have more children, but they're not offering any social benefits. In fact, they're cutting, various social benefits for having children. So yeah, can you talk about your experiences talking to various young people in China and how they're reacting to this?
Yeah. Population is a big theme in the book, and the dark legacy of Malthus, Thomas Malthus, is something I had to grapple with, as so many people still do, astonishingly enough. So I think one of the things that Malthus did was provide some kind of scientific proof of the phenomenon or experience of chronic scarcity. He argued that population growth was geometric, and that food supply growth was arithmetic. Complete bullshit. The first demographer, in a way. He wasn't credentialed as a demographer, but he was the first theorist of population. And his essay about population from 1798 was very influential, because he did try to provide this scientific proof of something that we all feel at some point or another, which is that there isn't enough to go around. And this perennial fear is easily parlayed into hysteria about overpopulationism. And even though Malthus himself never mentioned overpopulation, it's associated with him. Populationism takes many forms and has done over the centuries. And currently, I felt I had to return to this because of this phenomenon of the declining birth rate across most countries in the world are experiencing this, not just heavily industrialized countries. And the response to it takes different forms. I mean, in Arizona, for example, there is this hysteria about border crossing. In China, and it's racist. It's fundamentally racist. In China, it's a little different. China's had a long history with Malthus, both for and against, you could say. Mao was very anti-Malthusian. He thought that, he was pro-natalist. He thought that China's population growth was something that was part of its liberation from colonial fetters, and that Malthusian concerns about overpopulation were basically bourgeois. Until he changed his mind, or was persuaded to relent somewhat on this, and he his shift of mind paved the way for the one-child policy in the late 1970s. China now has three-child policy. And I was returning there to take testimony from young women about the demographic winter, and about the anxiety of the Chinese state managers. How are we going to reproduce the labor force when we have one of the lowest fertility rates in the world? This is a matter of anxiety, not just for the Chinese state, but also for investors all over the world who have their fortunes tied up in the Chinese economy still, because it's the locomotive of the global economy. So I took a lot of testimony from these women, and it took many forms. And they were Shanghainese women, and the resistance, quote unquote, to state pressure to reproduce is probably stronger in Shanghai than elsewhere. And I think partly because of the experience during COVID of Shanghai being so vigorously shut down and repressed during the pandemic, so that people essentially lost their vestigial trust in the government, even paid-up party members, of whom there are many in China. So that was the broad dimensions of what I was looking at there. And it's, to some extent, incomplete and unfinished. I'd like to go back and follow that chapter up in particular.
Yeah, maybe that's a nice place to kind of come to the end of the book and to conclude this conversation. I kind of wanted to ask you two questions. You end the book by kind of trying to get out of this zero-sum game, this debate between, let's say, degrowth on one hand and Green New Deal, if we want to call it that, on the other, right? So produce our way out of it through green energy, or just shut it all down, as a manner of speaking. But I also wanted to talk to you about methodology. So maybe you could try to go back to methodology and talk about these two things simultaneously. This book is published with Common Notions, a great publisher. But the same day that I read the last essay in the book, I also read your op-ed in the New York Times titled "The Israel-Gaza War Always Had an Unacknowledged Third Front," where you speak about the tens of thousands of Palestinian political prisoners, noting that since 1967, an estimated 1 million Palestinians have been arrested and locked up in less than legal ways, obviously. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to ask you, at the end of this book, you point to this notion of the public commons as a way of considering how not just to share resources, but how to reimagine production, circulation, reproduction, especially reproduction. And obviously, you're speaking to a particular audience with this book. And I just wonder how you think about writing for different platforms, ones that maybe some people might call on us to boycott, others that are have a smaller reach, but that are comradely in a way. I think you do a really good job of working between these different places. So yeah, if you could share a little bit about that.
Well, as you pointed out earlier, I am a bit of an eclectic, not just in politics, but also in choice of platforms to comment in or publish in. So I publish books with mainstream trade presses, university presses, independent left presses, and I'm quite promiscuous in that regard, and also in terms of articles for journalistic broadcast. I don't see the point of giving up access, whatever access you have, to the New York Crimes, for example. I'm not really a fan of that particular boycott. I think boycotts have to be smart, and you choose accordingly, and that's one that I chose not to abide by. But in terms of audience, I try to maintain a fairly even voice, so that the actual context of the publication doesn't overly determine what voice I'm using. And over the years, I've tried to find a voice that I feel comfortable with, that is, public facing for the most part. So the public commons model that you referred to is something I pitch. It's not my concept, but I am an advocate of it. And it came out of trying to parse this debate between Green New Dealers and degrowthers, which I think has consumed a lot of unnecessary energy. It's been an important debate, but I feel there are parts of it that are unnecessary, which is why the public commons model is a kind of hybrid. And to put it bluntly, I find a lot of Green New Dealers are focused on state and public power, or delivering green energy as a cure-all, not a cure-all, but as a primary cure. And degrowthers are interested in reorganizing society along different lines. They're obviously not growth-oriented, and tend to be more interested in the commons as a model for organizing. And I feel that there are all sorts of ways in which we can have a public commons model. Let's say Zoran Mandani, since we're here in New York, if he were elected, he could use his public power to ensure that important resources in whatever sector are managed by grassroots cooperatives or initiatives that are more commons-based. And that could be a very useful and dynamic model for other cities to follow. It's unclear whether that's something he's interested in. I find that his policy platform, while he says all the right things, his policy platform isn't very deep if you look more closely at it. And a lot of it is sloganizing at this point, which is fair enough. He'll have time to prove or provide a proof of concept for some of his rhetoric. But these are that's a very local example. But when it comes to cities that are innovating with policy, you do find that other cities very quickly pick up and emulate and try their own customized version of it. So it's conceivable that this could happen. And, we look to, Calau's Barcelona or Fajardo's Medellin. We transformed Medellin. There's a social housing model in Vienna. There's a 15-minute city in Paris, Hidalgo's Paris. Other examples you might think of that are innovative but are picked up and become internationalized in a way. So although they are local, they do have this sort of global impact. And that can happen very quickly in terms of urban initiatives.
It's repoliticizing the think globally, act locally.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Through material conditions.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's really easy for climate Leninism to become green capitalism very quickly. And it's very easy for degrowthers to become back to the landers very quickly. Yeah.
Climate Leninism. I like that.
Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. I hope this has been useful for listeners.